driving from Brooklyn into Manhattan for what is the 22nd anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. And today doesn't really seem like anything special. It kind of feels like the 20th anniversary 2 years ago was sort of the last milestone. But just out of sentimentality, and it's been storming for a while and the rain broke, I just spontaneously decided to drive into the city and, I don't know, maybe take a little ride or walk or skate down memory lane. So now I've driven into the city and I'm switching from my van to my bike, because it doesn't really make sense to drive around Ground Zero, aka the World Trade Center, on a 9/11 anniversary, even if it's the end of it. So now we're gonna go for a little cruise downtown. It astounds me that it's been 22 years since the attacks here in New York City and Washington and Pennsylvania. And now it's just mostly an ordinary day here in New York City. The new World Trade Center, One World Trade Center, is a tourist attraction and a vanity tower where the magazine Vanity Fair is headquartered, appropriately enough. But it's just so ordinary, and it's something that I still associate with so much trauma and chaos, sheer terror. But yet, walking here on this quiet, rainy night, it feels really solemn and calm. And of course, the new World Trade Center complex is nothing like the original, principally because it only consists of one super tall skyscraper. And the World Trade Center was known colloquially here in New York City and around the world as the Twin Towers. But when they opted to rebuild after the 9/11 attacks, they decided to make just one tower. And it was a decision that I never quite agreed with. I mean, there's a part of me, I guess, in a sort of a purist sense, that thought they should rebuild the towers exactly as they had been, even though they were kind of brutalist and modern and boxy. To me, they epitomize 1960s and 1970s Manhattan. And I don't know, there's something about them that I kind of loved. I know that a lot of architecture critics, when they were finished in the early 1970s, and for a time until the completion of the Sears Tower in Chicago, they were the tallest buildings in the world. And I know that critics, lampooned them for how sort of, unsexy and sort of unbeautiful that they were, as ineloquent as I'm sounding right now. But to me, they also symbolize my childhood, the 20th century, all the skylines from television shows and movies. And there just was a high degree of sentimentality, and I thought it kind of would have proved something to the world if we had rebuilt the World Trade Center exactly as it had been. Of course, that may have been an unpopular opinion at the time, although I'm not sure that it was. But, big real estate ended up winning out, and building two towers wasn't their goal. It wasn't their aim. The attacks here in Lower Manhattan 22 years ago set in motion a course of events that would come to shape my entire adult life. I had just turned 26 at the time, and I was really getting into photojournalism. And I was very specifically interested in the civil war in Afghanistan, in Central Asia / on the border of South Asia. And I was actually in talks with a couple of members of the Taliban who were based here in Queens in New York City, because they were lobbying the United Nations at the time to be recognized as the rightful rulers of that war-torn country. Because the the rump government that was sort of backed up in the northeast of the country, bordering Tajikistan and China at the time, they had the seat at the UN, and the Taliban very much wanted that legitimacy. And so I was really interested in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and I had researched the rise of Osama bin Laden in Pakistan back in 2000. I'd done a semester abroad in northwestern Pakistan. And so when these attacks hit, it ended up just accelerating a trip to Afghanistan that I was already working on. Instead of entering the country, in areas under Taliban control from Pakistan, I ended up entering the country from Tajikistan in the areas under the government control. And I pledged to myself that I would follow the terror wars wherever they went, for as long as they went, and wherever they took me. Which partly meant that after the US and its Afghan allies ousted the Taliban at the end of 2001, then 18 months later, after that war began, I was in Iraq when the United States destroyed a sovereign nation state led by the hideous, evil Ba'ath Party of then President Saddam Hussein. And the United States and its president at the time, George W. Bush, declared a war on terror. And it was put in this very kind of 20th century Cold War-esque binary tone that you are with us or you are with the terrorists, or just them. But it was never defined to the American public who the terrorists were, which terrorist groups was the United States and its allies ready to fight, and for how long was it going to fight them, and what would victory look like? None of these things were ever laid out to the American public in the Ummah al-Islamiyya, the global Islamic community, or other Western nations like, the states of the European Union, or our partners in Australia and New Zealand and so forth. And then it just all kind of ended. 2 summers ago, the United States pulled out of Afghanistan, and the Taliban quickly took control, and now they control essentially 100% of the country. The Taliban control more of Afghanistan now than they did on this day 22 years ago. So that really says what a failure the terror wars were writ large. And think of all the people killed, and the lives destroyed, and just so many things that were shattered. The Republic of Iraq was shattered, and it's just like, what the hell was it all for? And who really was the enemy? I don't know. I don't come down to the World Trade Center all that often these days. I kind of feel out of place here. It's mainly a tourist destination. And ringing the fountains, hardly any English is being spoken right now. Most people are from Northeast Asia or Western Europe or Southern South America and all over the world. South Asia. People are from everywhere. There are almost no Americans here, just listening in at the fountain while people look up at the towers of light. Over the years, I covered all of the key anniversaries here at Ground Zero, as it was known for a time, as a photographer. So in 2002, I was here for the first anniversary of 9/11, where I marched over the Brooklyn Bridge with NYPD bagpipers. I was then here for the 5th anniversary of 9/11 in 2006, the 10th anniversary of 9/11 in 2011, where I actually photographed both the Obamas and the Bushes awkwardly side by side together. Then, after interest began to really wane, I still kept at it, so long as I was home, at least for all the milestone anniversaries. Even I stopped coming every year at the time, but I was here for the 15th anniversary, and then for the 20th anniversary. So this has been so much a part of my life, and it's been hard for me to accept that it's just another day. It's kind of like there's an old cliche that every war zone eventually becomes a tourist destination, and the World Trade Center / Ground Zero for me really has that feel. And aside from just covering all of the key memorial occasions here at Ground Zero and the terror wars on the ground in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places, including, of course, the Arab uprisings of 2011, I also doggedly photographed the lives and whereabouts of the hijackers all over this world like nobody else. And I haven't published any of these things. No one has ever seen this vast archive that I have. But I've got photos of the hijackers' doings in Hamburg, Germany, in central Malaysia, in the greater Kuala Lumpur metropolitan area, in California, Spain. I mean, the list goes on. So the terror wars were so much a part of my adulthood, my late 20s, all of my 30s, even into my early 40s. They just they sort of embodied the mission that I was on, which was to investigate and to get to the truth and to understand really what happened to this city that I call home. And another thing is, I wanted to dispel the baseless conspiracy theories that were propelled by, the early days of the internet until today, and they still exist. A large part of that is the fault of the US government. Part of it is easily the fault of the Saudi government, because so much about how the attacks took place hasn't been disclosed. Or if it has, it's happened on a Friday at like 8 p.m. on a summer night when nobody's paying attention to the news cycle. I think that's what happened with the 28 pages, as they are known, that were just finally unredacted a couple of years ago. And to be sure, 9/11 was definitely a conspiracy, and it was a conspiracy by a group of men from Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, and the United Arab Emirates, plus a couple other of allies from Yemen and Malaysia and a handful of other places. So it definitely was a conspiracy. It just wasn't some sort of deep state conspiracy that a lot of people would like to think. It just was, it's just a hard reality that 9/11 happened. And there are people to this day who can't accept that reality, who think that somehow the images were manipulated, or, and I think partly that is based on racism, which is that a group of Arab men couldn't have accomplished something like this, so that it had to be some other group of men. It had to be either a group of Zionists or a group of Western Protestants, or maybe a mix of those two. And I mean, 9/11, all these years later, it's still a very divisive issue in an incredibly toxic, deeply unhealthy way. Another thing I've done over the years is document the Towers of Light, which began not on the first anniversary of 9/11, but actually on the 6-month anniversary. And as these glorious towers of light beam into the night sky here in Lower Manhattan, the war on terror exists as an open wound, even though I would argue that the Taliban taking back over Afghanistan was kind of the end of the terror wars. I think, at least in the psyche of the American public, voters and just many in the world. But there's still so many questions about the plot, the attacks, and why Guantanamo still exists. And there's been no justice for the 9/11 families. So many suspects involved in the plot were killed in drone strikes. So part of what I mean about how much information has not been disclosed about 9/11 is that the United States government, particularly the administration of Barack Obama, just assassinated extrajudicially with drones so many of the suspects. There's so many things that we could have learned if we'd have captured these men and put them on trial. And at the time, we were told things like, oh, well, the Obama administration is like being, risk averse, that it's easier to hit, some guy in a convoy in Marib Governorate in, central or southern Yemen, with a drone than it is to put special operators in there, and maybe they get into a firefight and get injured and it's hard to extract them, and maybe the guy gets away and the drone strike is sort of a sure thing. I would argue that all of these parts of the terror wars were failure, from Guantanamo to the drone wars, to the American occupation of Afghanistan, to the invasion and occupation of Iraq. Every single aspect of the terror wars was a failure of some kind or another. Sure, there were momentary victories, like the killing of Osama bin Laden in May of 2011, perfectly in time for the 10th anniversary of the attacks here in New York. But I just feel like no justice has been served. It's such a depressing thing. And now, like, so much time has gone by that, are we really going to reopen this case, in sort of in the sense of memory and ethics and all sorts of emotional and sentimental issues? New York City has really moved on, and the destruction of the World Trade Center ended up ushering in an era of gentrification. And in the 12 years that Michael Bloomberg ruled New York as mayor, he basically remade the city in his own image. And so, New York after 9/11 is just a very, very different place, not just in terms of globalization, but in terms of just the corporatization of it and the remaking of the real estate landscape and rents. And, on 9/11, New York was still a reasonable place in terms of expenses and just, a place to live. Sure, quality of life was imperfect, but it's certainly not good now after the pandemic. So, it just meant so much to New York, and, it brought up just so much change, and most of it, really, really not good. But here we are, and I guess I'm thankful to say that I survived 9/11, and I survived all of the terror wars unscathed. So I'm thankful for that. I was never hit by a single bullet or piece of shrapnel in all of my trips to Afghanistan and Iraq and, all the other places in the ensuing years: Libya, Syria, Mali, Lebanon, Kyrgyzstan, the Republic of Georgia, Kashmir, Pakistan, and so on and so on. So listen, I want to thank you guys. If you've lasted this long, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.